I actually start all my workshops. I preface my workshops with the question, look around the room and tell me what materials are in the room with you. And a lot of times people stop and they're like, huh. And they kind of look around and they're like naming the things. And I'm like, okay, so consider the fact that you're constantly in relationship with these materials. You're sitting on the couch, you're laying on the bed, you are wrapping your hair with something. The toothbrush bristles are made out of a fiber. There's just so many different things. We're always constantly touching something or being touched by something. I'm like, so is the relationship healthy or is it toxic?
Welcome to She Really Gets It, a public health podcast. I'm Stephanie Rhodes, a Black woman, public health professional, and your guide to understanding how policies, institutions, and the systems that uphold them harm the public's health, but also how people are coming together to repair that harm and change the system. Today, we are talking to someone who seems like an unlikely guest for a public health podcast. Her name is Mahdiyyah Muhammad, and she's a fashion designer. And I wanted to bring her on after hearing about her research on the negative health impacts of synthetic fibers on predominantly Black communities, from production to pairing those polyester pants with your favorite top. As always, I did background research on my guest and discovered that she describes herself as a fabric alchemist. And what is a fabric alchemist, might you ask? According to Mahdiyya, a fabric alchemist is someone who essentially transforms one material into a different form, alchemizing discarded textile or fabric into something new, more purposeful, and more beautiful. In addition to fabric alchemy, Mahdiyya is also a researcher, which is what led her to focus on how synthetic fibers end up in predominantly Black communities. One of these ways is through zoning, and we can't talk about zoning, which is the process of partitioning a city or a town into different zones for different purposes, without talking about the very racist legacy of redlining. I've been thinking a lot about redlining lately, and specifically, and people don't know what redlining is, there were different programs during the New Era deal that were supposed to benefit all Americans. And one of those programs was the Federal Housing Administration, I believe. So that kind of comes from those home ownership programs that were supposed to help everyone, but primarily only helped white Americans. Black people were excluded from those, and they were not guaranteed those same loans. To this day, you have redlined areas where Black people still live that have less political power. In those areas, those are also areas where you have more pollution, higher incidence of things like asthma and different cancers. Is there a correlation between redlining and what we see in terms of fabrics and synthetic fibers and the use of those?
Yes, absolutely. It actually is completely connected to the research that I do and examines the connections between synthetic fabrics, urban development, and health issues within our communities. A lot of people don't know this, but exactly like what you explained, those same communities end up being zoned for certain types of businesses to be allowed to be built there and set up. And what happens is during urban development and planning, they decide what areas get zoned for what specific types of businesses. So commercial use, residential use, that sort of thing. In our communities at a greater rate seem to be zoned for fast fashion stores and chain retailers. And these clothing stores tend to contain a lot of synthetic fibers. So think polyester, nylon, lycra, spandex, right? And just to throw a couple of names out there, some of us might be familiar with these stores: Rainbow, Easy Pickings, 10 Spot, Pretty Girl, all these different stores. And these are stores that I grew up with in East Orange, so I'm very familiar. Yeah. But the funny thing, well, not the funny thing is, the sad thing is that my mother would have to drive 45 minutes or an hour outside of our community just to get access to natural material clothing, natural material linens for the house, things of that nature. So the research that I'm doing is talking about that, but also the history of how this has potentially impacted our health over time in our communities.
So you started out in fabric design, correct?
Correct.
So what led you to say, I want to do research, and specifically, I want to look at the impact of the clothing that I'm wearing, that people in my community are wearing, on their health? How did you make that connection?
So pre-pandemic, I actually had a shift where I went to Barbados and I spent 3 months on the island. And when I was there, I just got to really move around the island and live slower and just gain an appreciation for textiles and natural materials specifically. The history of Sea Island cotton is very connected to Barbados. So I went to the local museum there and did some research about the enslaved people that came to the island and what they did with the crops and growing Sea Island cotton and how coveted that crop is. and how that also contributed to the industrial boom here. And in getting into that, I also spent time with one of the elders on the island who is a loom artist. So he creates his own textiles, right? And that whole process really changed the way I looked at material. And when I got back home, I remember just thinking, I only want to do clothing that's made from natural material. Like, how do I do this? Of course, it was extremely expensive. And I was like, why is it so expensive to get my hands on linen, 100% organic cotton, things like that? And then what I did was shift my perspective and start to think, okay, so if I can't, maybe I don't need to source raw material. So maybe I should mostly focus on post-consumer textile waste since there's already so much clothing out there as it is. So I went back to my roots of thrifting and going to the Goodwills and the Salvation Armies, which is what I grew up doing. And essentially I started to just do what I call flipping tags, where you actually read the care label. So what is the clothing made out of? And the more I did that, the more I realized in our communities, a lot of the clothing that ends up in our thrift stores is not natural material. It's a lot of times fast fashion that's coming from these fast fashion retailers and ending up in our stores and in our communities, even more, of course. So I was like, this is insane. So I took it upon myself to then shift how I was creating and was like, I'm only going to use natural materials. And then in doing that, I also got curious about researching those materials. So I was like curious about linen because linen comes from the flax plant, which a lot of people don't know. Okay. And I was like, well, linen comes from the flax plant. So what are the other uses and properties of this plant? Can you do oil with it? Which you can. You can also do flour. There's so many different things with that. And it's considered a healing fabric because even in the healthcare industry, the sheets in hospital beds, for example, were made of linen before they started to shift to poly cotton blend. So then I was like, okay, well then when did the shift happen? I just started going deeper and deeper down the wormhole of research. And that's what brought me to being curious about how these fibers and fabrics are affecting our skin, because the skin is the largest organ of our body.
That's actually like so interesting you bring up hospitals. I worked in hospitals for quite a few years. And of course, I was even a patient in a hospital, and I was a Black woman patient in a hospital. And I could go on and on about that experience of not being listened to in general. But one of the things that happened to me in the hospital is I suffered with asthma as a kid, but I never had eczema. And I was in the hospital a few days, and it started, and all of a sudden, like day 3 in the hospital, I had like this weird patch like on my face, like on my eyelids. And I was like, what is that? Didn't know what it was. And, you know, I got home, went back to the doctor, but I have this weird patch and it keeps spreading, and it spread to the other eyelid. And they were like, oh, this looks like you have a little eczema. And I was like, I don't have eczema. And it wasn't until years later that I went to a Black dermatologist who said, oh, well, you know, in the hospital, you're exposed to all sorts of things, especially in surgery. It could the adhesive from the tape, everything that you're covered in, like the bed sheets, everything, your skin. It's not an immediate reaction, but it'll happen a few days later. It makes sense that you had that reaction, and it took probably about 3 to 5 days for it to really like trigger.
Yes.
And so I never thought about all the things in the hospital that I'm coming into contact with. Even as a public health professional, I didn't necessarily always, I think about infections, you know, who's coming in and out of the room, you know, the cleanliness of the room, certain types of bacteria. I didn't necessarily think about, oh, the actual bed linens. Of course, they're not fully linen anymore, as you explained, but like the actual materials that they're using to clothe me could be having an effect on my health in a place where I'm supposed to be taken care of and given proper care. So that is so interesting that you bring that up.
I actually start all my workshops. I preface my workshops with the question, look around the room and tell me what materials are in the room with you. And a lot of times people stop and they're like, huh. And they kind of look around and they're like naming the things. And I'm like, okay, so consider the fact that you're constantly in relationship with these materials. You're sitting on the couch, you're laying on the bed, you are wrapping your hair with something. The toothbrush bristles are made out of a fiber. There's just so many different things. We're always constantly touching something or being touched by something. I'm like, so is the relationship healthy or is it toxic? Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. You're making us have deep thoughts.
That's what I want.
No. Yes. Because we don't often think about it. And when we think about cost can be a barrier for a lot of people when it comes to what they want to wear. What advice do you give people who want to be more conscious of what they're putting on their body, and how do they prioritize in terms of their finances, like whether or not what's worth it in terms of cost? So like buying that more expensive coat for the winter versus the things that, I don't know, that your work clothes, your white linen shirt, or is it worth the extra cost, and how should people prioritize, or what do you advise?
Well, first, there are real barriers to entry for accessibility, sustainable things, things that are healthy for our communities. And that is a problem. And that's something that is out of our control, right? It has been for a while. But on the other hand, I do always tell people it is worth it if you can afford it to spend the money to get better quality clothing. But I also tell people if you can't, then it also will help you to learn how to upcycle, how to repurpose things. And then when you go into thrift stores, for example, read the care labels. Read the care labels and see that something that you're purchasing is 100% silk, 100% cotton, 100% hemp, linen, right? And really try to focus on natural fibers as much as you can. And the percentage of synthetic fibers, you want it to be as low as possible. It's the same thing as when you go grocery shopping and you read the ingredients on the box, which I hope people are doing. And if they're not, I hope they start doing after they listen to this. So I tell people, really, we should treat the care and the process of the thought that we put into what we're putting into our bodies just as much as what we put on our bodies. So that's what I would say. And that's a big reason why I started to teach the workshops, because I realized everybody can't afford a $300, $400 dress or a pair of pants. So what is another way that I can allow access to this practice and allow access to this? And my way was to just start to teach people about it and how to do it and educate our communities about it and explain to them that you do have access in some ways, just not in the same ways as the predominantly wealthy and white communities.
And you know what, for when I started this podcast, I really started it because I wanted the focus to be on the most marginalized, which is often Black people.
Yes.
And if we think about Black women, Black trans women, Black cisgendered women, and I think what people often don't realize, especially white people that may be listening to this, often I feel like they don't care because they don't think it directly affects them. Right? And not realizing, no, this all comes back to you, right? So we are the canary in the coal mine, right?
Yeah.
This is coming for you, right? This does not stay contained. When I think about fast fashion stores, I was watching a documentary, I think it was called Brandy Hellville, about a clothing store that I knew nothing about because I'm not a 14-year-old girl. So I knew nothing about this. And it was through watching that I was learning. I didn't realize that we force other countries to take our trash.
Yes.
Right. And that is one of the ways in which we also greatly contribute to climate change is the fast fashion. It gets discarded. It doesn't just stay in the U.S. It goes to another country, another continent, and they are forced to take that. Can you give us some insight on what that means for like the health of the global South and also just our health here and how it might be contributing or how it is contributing to climate change?
Yeah, just like you said, a lot of that, I mean, people think that once they drop off their clothing at the local thrift or secondhand, that somehow it gets purchased and it just magically disappears into the ether. But what actually happens is that they have textile sorting facilities where even by the time it reaches the rack, somebody has already sorted and picked out what's still considered good. And there's still throwaway, like tons of billions and tons of it. And then that gets packaged and then that gets sent out to recycling, like textile recycling facilities. And then beyond that point, that is when they start to do the secret dumping offshore. So that ends up in shores in Africa. It ends up, I think, places in East Asia, things like that. And not only are these people having to deal with the fact that they're the unfair labor practices of actually, enslavement that is in the textile industry still happening. But now we're bringing it back to their communities, bringing it back to their environments, and we're doing things like polluting their main source of water, right? Or polluting their crops, right? And what happens is when you wear and work with synthetic materials like polyester, it contains microplastics. And whenever it's washed or worn, it releases particles into the atmosphere, particles into the water, and this becomes harmful for the animals, the, people who use that main source of water. And it's just, that's how that happens. And it also happens in our communities here in the U.S. and our Black communities. I tell people all the time, I'm like, as soon as you wash polyester, it's released into your water system. Like, that's how it works. You're wearing it, you're sweating, the condensation from it, it's getting seeped into your skin. So, yeah.
We're learning more that all of us basically have microplastics in our brain.
Yes.
Which is in our blood. So I have been thinking like, okay, it's from the nonstick cookware. It is in the food. It is, in things that I'm directly consuming. And while I'm a consumer and purchasing clothes, I don't always think of the clothes that I'm wearing getting into my body and getting into my water and getting into my food.
I actually had a conversation with my dentist about this because he's like, so what work do you do? And I started talking to him about the work that I'm doing. He's like, okay, so now I feel like my wife and I are going to have to throw away everything. We were really, really thinking it was just the cookware that we had to look out for. Now it's clothes. I was like, it's pretty much it's in everything. I'm not going to lie to you. And I was like, so I don't want you to get that scary, like, doom thinking, but just here are a few things you can do. And we talked about it a little bit, but I thought that was so funny that you brought up the cookware because he and I had a conversation where I almost gave him a little bit of a history lesson because a lot of people aren't even aware of how synthetic fibers entered the U.S. Like it wasn't just something we always had. So I'm like, during World War II, there was like this shortage of natural fibers like cotton and wool because they wanted to tell all citizens like, do your duty, contribute anything cotton or wool for the process of creating things for the soldiers. So everybody was just giving away their cotton, their wool, their natural fiber clothing so that they can make equipment, materials, and clothing for the soldiers, right? And then the shortage led to somebody named DuPont, which is basically a chemical company. They were founded in 1802 by a French-American chemist, right? But he took it and accelerated the development of nylon, which is a synthetic fiber. But that was created in 33. Polyester didn't come until, I want to say like 39, maybe 1940, 50 range. But DuPont focused initially on creating gunpowder. And then it evolved and became known for developing materials and chemicals like nylon and Teflon, which is the cookware, like we talked about. And that's the coating, that's nonstick coating. And so after the war, nylon and other synthetic fibers like polyester, they got popular in civilian clothing because initially they were using nylon and polyester and things like that to create the parachutes for the soldiers. And then after the war, then it became popular for clothing. And then it changed the fashion industry because it became this like magic material that never wrinkles, it's durable, it's quick drying, and it comes in all these different colors, right? So that was a big thing. But what people didn't know was like that the polyester and synthetic fibers contain microplastics like we talked about, right? They're made from petrochemicals. And that's a form of plastic, which we just talked about. So when polyester fabric is washed, the tiny fibers break off and it enters the water system, right? But then another part of it is that the synthetic dyes that are used to give us those bright, bold, beautiful colors contain azo dyes, formaldehyde, and lead. So all of these things are also, it's just like a cocktail of toxicity.
And of course, it would be DuPont, right?
Of course.
Like, I've been thinking about like how in the United States, in the West in general, I was trying to think of what do we create that is life-giving, right? Like, and what do we create that just creates mass death? We ship out arms, we create bombs, we like, I think it was even like UPenn was having protests because like you're working with a weapons manufacturer, you're working to create things that just create death. They don't contribute anything positive to this world, right? And I think about like that's what we produce, right? People can't get an education without going hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt, right? We don't invest in education. I'm in Mississippi right now at my mom's house. Teachers here are not allowed to unionize, right? It is actually illegal for them to unionize. Like they will lose their job. Like it's an anti-union state, right? So everything that we can do to make the masses less educated, everything we can do to poison food, to ship out bombs, we export death. And of course that touches everything. When you mentioned the fact that this started with World War II, right? It was all to help to further the war effort, right?
Yep.
And then of course from that it comes back to us. It's that imperial boomerang, I guess. So that's the term everyone's using right now. Of it comes back to us. It's like now, like guess what? We're gonna give you something that is life giving. These linens, these cottons, and then we're gonna return back polyester. We're gonna return back these synthetic fibers that poison you, that poison the earth, that poison your food, that then go out and poison people across the globe.
Yep.
And now we're all living with the repercussions of it. And not to get on like a negative road, but I want to think more about like, what can we do? Because it seems like those that are in power aren't really too invested in things that are life-giving.
Hmm.
And that's why I think the work that you do is so interesting. What are things that our listeners can do to contribute to your efforts, of course, and also just to like live more healthfully just in terms of what they wear? So what are little things that they can do every day or when they're going out to shop?
Hmm. My first thing is I always tell people the most sustainable thing you can do is obviously not buy new. The second thing is to swap. So if you have friends or family, or if you're about to get rid of something, pass it on to somebody that you know is actually going to use it. If there's things in your closet that don't fit, go to your local cleaners or tailor and get them altered. A lot of times the cleaners have been in our communities for a long time as well, so that's also sustainable. If you have something and the lining is polyester, maybe you can switch it out for silk lining, like things like that.
Oh,
Yeah, fix a
I
zipper.
never thought about that.
And then I also tell people read the labels, like flip the tags and read the labels so that you actually know what's in the clothing and you know where it's made. Like become more self-aware of what it is that you're purchasing and like where your money is going, right? Look into who these companies are, find out who's funding them, like get more curious about these things because I think the more curious we get, that's how we start to kind of enact more change in policies. And the next thing I would say is in terms of kind of supporting the research that I'm doing, I'm actually moving into the next phase of the research with the Black Fiber and Textile Network. And what we're going to be doing is looking to potentially create community closets, almost like pop-ups, where our communities can access natural fiber clothing, natural fiber bed linens, baby blankets, tank tops, pillowcases, head wraps, things like that. And in order to do that, I'm obviously going to need funding. So I would say go to the website and check out the donate tab. And if you can, whatever you can send and share, it would be helpful. I'm always also down to talk to people about what it is that I do. So if they want to book me for workshops or to talk about these things, I do that as well. So each time I teach a workshop anyway, it's not just about like creating a tangible, cool thing to walk away with. They're always started with an introductory research explanation where I share all this information. And then the second part of the research, the workshop, is where we put that into practice and create something.
Wow. You know what? You've mentioned the Black Textile Network a few times. And can you tell us more about the Black Textile Network? Who it consists of? What is the work that y'all are doing on a consistent basis?
Yeah. So the Black Fiber and Textile Network was started by a woman named Teju Adisa Farrar. And what she essentially wanted to do was create a supply network, not supply chain, that is all people from the diaspora. So even in the Caribbean, on the continent, in the States, and they're fiber farmers. So you have farmers who grow their own cotton, who are starting to grow their own linen. We also have sheep herders, and who are producing wool, things of that nature. And then there's also groups that are natural dye artists. So they work with the actual plant stuff in nature and they turn that into pigment and dye. And then we also have weavers. We have people who can spin into yarn and thread. And then we also have people who can turn that into T-shirts and actual clothing and product. And then, of course, there's artists. So it's an entire network of us who are doing this work all over. And then we have people who are teaching about these things. So that's essentially what the short film was about, Woven from Nature. It's a 7-minute documentary about this work and how we want to get more of the word out there, continue to get the funding to keep this going, and to also make sure that these people who are doing this work are getting noticed and also getting opportunities to continue to fund the work that they're doing because it's important and we need it.
That's amazing. That's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us such nice and concise steps of things that we can do in terms of upcycling. I'm actually sitting here. Okay, so so when we say upcycling, and you mentioned like some of the terminology that gets utilized. So this blanket behind me, this blanket was made by my like I guess great grandmothers.
Oh, wow.
Or because they were all like, they did lots of quilt work. Quilting was something that they always did. So but we never thought of it as like upcycling or anything like that. So we don't always think of that. So I think some of this terminology, like you said, like even in public health, they use terminology that I hate. They're like, it's a health disparity. I'm like, it's racism.
Just call it that. But it's so crazy that you said that because that's something I always talk about, like we shared, is just the language. Language is also a barrier. And the fact that you just say your grandma's like quilted that, like, yeah, the women who were quilters are the early pioneer sustainability movers. Like, that's who created this. And like, that's who I look to for inspiration, because my process is quilting. Essentially, that's what I'm doing when I'm patchworking, because that's what they were doing. So that's why I started to call it regenerative fashion instead of sustainable fashion, or like ancestral fashion, like trying to find these other ways to still connect it back to the origins of what this thing is. And I'm like, what y'all are not going to do is continue to remove us from these spaces and keep pivoting and pivoting until we don't even know what it's called, and like don't even understand that it's already what we've been doing. I think that's another part of the work, is like memory work, and reclaiming, and just making sure to say, like, no, this is something that's inherently ancestral to what my great grandmothers did. So making sure that people understand that, and just calling it out when I see it, because it's a very white space, white women specifically. And a lot of times we're not given the platforms to talk about it, which is crazy, because we should be the main ones talking about it and leading it, not only because we started it, but also because our communities are most deeply impacted by what's going on. And then another really big example of that I can give you when it comes to actual craft is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Kawandi quilting.
No.
Or Siddhi quilting, Siddi, but the Siddhi women are located in India, and they're a group of women who migrated from Africa. Like, there's the Siddhi people migrated from Africa to India through slavery, through trade, different reasons, but they took the quilting practice that they had there with them, and it's called Kawandi. But essentially what they're doing is they're hand stitching a quilt from counterclockwise from the outside corner to the inside, like into the center. And once they get to the center, they place a few grains of rice in the center, and then they gift it to someone in the family, friends, community, and it's supposed to say, may you never go hungry. And the practice is so specific to these women who migrated there. A lot of them don't call themselves African anymore, just because they've kind of grown there and like that's their community now. But they're really facing issues where people keep trying to close in on that land and take it from them. And the crazy thing is, every time I see people teaching the workshop, they're not Black.
Yeah.
They're not African. So I'm like, what's happening here? Are we going to leave out the part of the history of this thing and just only say it's this beautiful quilting practice, but not talk about where it originated or who started it? So that's something I've been doing, and I'm like starting to get deeper into quilting, and that's the quilting practice that most resonates with me, and I think that's why.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. I think that's what happens. We lose sight of where things come from, so they're easily taken over, stolen, and you have people that are so willing to take credit as well, which is always like
Telling you.
me because I never, right? Like I could never even think about like, let me take credit for an entire other demographics work and destroy the origin of it, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, what's often given back, what's created in those spaces is like something that is just, what is the word I'm looking for here? But I don't want to say it's such a cheapened version of the real thing. It loses its color, it loses its texture, it loses so much in that moment. And when that happens, and it's that intentional erasure, 'cause I feel like when you do things like that, you almost have to erase the original, right? Because they're going to show you up, right? It's going to be very obvious, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who the indigenous people are, right? Who the authenticity, like you can't really stand in the space of that when you have stolen it, when you have creating the cheapened version of it, the Temu version of it, so to speak.
I like that. I like that. That's good. That's good.
It's insane. That is amazing. And I'd never heard them before. So thank you for the education.
Yes. I mean, definitely check it out. It's such a beautiful practice.
Honestly, thank you for taking the time to do this. I know that you are extremely busy. I feel like now, like in today's world, I feel like we're all kind of, I don't know. I guess I feel like we're like Renaissance women. I feel like Black women are Renaissance women, like in this era, right? Like I feel like we're kind of having to build our own careers outside of like these traditional norms. And especially in public health, like I know so many Black women who were honestly pushed out of the field of public health. and started their own consultancies or started doing more contract work because it is such a white dominated space.
I really like when you were mentioning how a lot of us, specifically women, and even in the public health space, are having to create their own and like branch out because we're kind of being pushed out of spaces. And something about that also makes me think about the fact that a lot of us from a very young age are groomed to homogenize all of our skills and our talents and what we do creatively. And it's very much tied to capitalism and white supremacy and this idea that you have to be one thing, right? They're so obsessed with binary and this idea of it's either this or it's that. And there's never an in-between. There's never a gray area. There's never room for other. So I feel like our communities naturally, we are other, right? Our experiences are other. We have very layered perspectives based on just everything we've experienced in this country, right? So I think it's impossible for us to fit ourselves into these tiny little boxes and go with this group and check all these boxes and things on the list. And I feel like it's also really just made us collectively miserable. And now we're all starting to finally see that that's not natural. Nothing in nature is this or that. That doesn't make any sense. So how are human animals any different, right? And that's how I think about that. So what the work that I do, I make sure I do this and I do this and I also do this and I also do that. And it's like, you're not going to make me feel like that's too much. You're not going to make me feel like I need to say one thing or give myself one title, because I do many and I do it well. So I'm going to talk about the things that I do, and I'm also going to encourage other people to do that because my perspective is layered. My upbringing is layered. The things I've experienced and seen are layered. So how can I not apply that to what I'm giving to the community?
Yeah, and I think we often pathologize that behavior as well, right? Oh, you're so many things. You're not focused. You're not this. It's like, well, I'm good at many things.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm good at many things, and it's up to me to say what I'm good at, right? It doesn't make any sense. I think as Black women especially, we can't sit around waiting for someone to validate us. You will never find what you're seeking if you're looking for validation.
Because the creation of rubrics were literally to push things into one standard way of grading and deciding what's good, what's bad. And it's like, even in education, how do you give a child a rubric? No child is going to be the same. So to say every child has to test a certain way, they have to respond a certain way, it makes absolutely no sense. And now we have to apply that to everything else in life? No, thank you.
If you would like to learn more about the work Mahdiyya is doing, you can find her on Instagram at Mahdiyah Official and on LinkedIn at Mahdiyyah Muhammad. I'll put links for all of her contacts in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode of She Really Gets It, please review and rate this podcast via Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you have any topics you believe we should explore on future episodes, you can join my Substack and reply to any of the emails I send out. Links to that will also be in the show notes.